How to create environments that work with the turn-based tactic project. When building your environments, there are a few things you have to keep in mind to make sure that they are going to work with the grid. It's not that it's super complicated, most environments are going to work without any changes, but I'm just going to go through all the little requirements so you're aware what they are. So let's get to it. Okay, so in Unreal, we're going to create a whole new environment together completely from start to finish. I'm going to reuse some meshes that are already in the project just because it's going to be a little bit more interesting than if I place, let's say, cubes and spheres in the level. So instead, I'm just going to use my own platforms, bridges, and bushes. But it's just because it's going to be more interesting. I don't have anything special with those meshes. It's just basic meshes with some basic collisions on them. You can use any meshes you have. As long as they have collision, it should work. So, okay, let's create a new level. So I'm going to go with File, New Level, create a new basic level. So that's the basic level that comes with Unreal 5. And I'm using that one just because it has lighting and I don't have to worry about that. So I have a nice level with some nice lighting in it, so that's good. The first step when I'm creating a new level is to decide which type of grid I want to use for that level. Do I want to use a square grid for that environment, an hexagon grid, or maybe a triangle grid, and how big do we want the grid to be? So to do that, I'm going to use the BP grid as a guide while I'm placing the elements around, so I know that they are going to be perfectly aligned with the grid when we spawn the grid in the game. So to do that, I'm going to use the BP grid. So BP grid that we have in the project, and I'm just going to drop it in my level right here. Here we go, I have a grid. And now I can move it around if I want to, so put my grid here, there, doesn't really matter. But the important thing is to decide what we want to do with that grid. So do we want a big grid or a small grid? I'm just gonna go right here in my grid generation, and I can decide to, let's say, have a big grid, so 400 by 400. Okay, that's a pretty big grid. Do we want that? Not sure, it's a little bit big. What if I want a smaller grid, so 50 by 50? There we go, that's going to generate really small tiles, just like that. It's nice, but it's too small. In my case, I'm just going to leave it to 200 by 200 because all my assets are made to fit nicely on the 200 by 200 grid, and that's what I'm using in my project, so I'm just going to use the 200 by 200 because I think it's a nice tile size. But you can obviously use the tile size you want because, well, that's a setting right here. You just have to tweak it and it should work. And for the height right here, the Z value of the grid tile size, it's going to affect how high the units can jump between tiles. So if I have a step which is 100 units higher than the previous tile, the unit should be able to walk onto it because that value right here is 100. But if the tile is, let's say, 200 higher, so that's a pretty big jump, the unit is not going to reach it unless you increase that value to, let's say, 200. Or if you want your unit to only be able to walk small steps, you can make it, let's say, 10, 20, 50, doesn't really matter as long as you build your level with that into consideration. So if that value is super big, well, you can make it super big and the unit is going to be able to go through those tiles. But in my case, I'm just going to leave it to 100. I think a step of 100 units is pretty good. But actually, I think I went a little bit too fast right now because we decided how big we want the grid, but we didn't decide what shape of grid we wanted. I think that's probably the first thing to think about. Do we want to have a square grid? Do we want to have an hexagon grid or maybe a triangle grid? And that's probably going to affect the size of the tiles you want to have. Do you want big triangles, small triangles, and things like that? But in my case, I already knew that I wanted a square grid, so I'm just going to leave it to 200 by 200 and a shape of a square, just because it's simpler to set up. But in your case, if you want to have an hexagon grid, for example, it's not an issue. Just switch it to hexagon, then decide how big you want your tile. So let's say 300 by 300, and you can build your level like that. But for me, I'm going to stay with my 200 by 200 square grid. Here we go. Then the grid tile count in this case is just going to affect how big the grid is in the viewport. So let's say 30 by 30. Here we go. I have a pretty big grid in my level, or I can make it super small. It doesn't really matter in this case right now because it's not going to affect the combat or anything. It's just how big the grid is going to be in your level while you're designing it. So if you have a huge level and you want to see the whole grid on top of the whole level, I don't really recommend it, but you can make it like, let's say, super big, like 200 by, let's say, 10. I don't want to make it too big, otherwise it's going to crash, but you can make it like pretty big. I think 200 by 100, it should not be too bad. Actually, never mind, it took a little bit to generate, but once the grid is generated, it's not too bad. But yeah, in my case, I'm just going to keep it to something that is somewhat small, so let's say 20 by 20. There we go. So we have a good surface area to work with, and if, let's say, our level is bigger than that, we can just move the grid around, and that's not an issue. It's really just a level creation process right now. We're not going to start any combat on top of that grid. It's just to generate generate the level. So good. Okay, now we have a grid. It's nice. It's placed properly in the level and we can start building it. And my first step is actually going to be to delete that floor because I don't want it. I want to use my own floor. So I'm just going to use my platforms instead. So I have, let's say, this platform right here. I can place it right there. I'm going to scale it accordingly. So let's say not 40, 4 by 4. So I have a pretty big platform to start with. Here we go. I'm going to make sure that it is aligned properly with the grid. So here we go. I have my platform right here. It's aligned with the grid. Then I'm going to create another platform right here next to it. I'm going to make it a little bit higher. That's pretty good. Then I'm going to take another platform. I'm going to make it, let's say, here. I can rotate it just like that. I'm going to place it, let's say, right here. It's pretty good. Make sure that it is aligned with the grid. That's really important. Then I'm going to move it here. I can make it a little bit smaller, this one. So let's say 2 by 2. I can put it like here. I want a square, so 2 by 4. Why not? So now I have a square here. I can put that one, let's say, here, a little bit lower or maybe higher. Doesn't really matter. As long as I can build my level around those. So I'm just gonna put that one here a little bit higher. Then I'm going to select this one, place it, let's say, here. There we go. So I have a nice little hole in my grid, which is not really the case right now, but we're going to fix that in a second. I'm just going to continue placing platforms all around, making sure that they are aligned with the grid, otherwise it's going to cause issues. But I'm going to show you what it does in a second because I'm placing them a little bit randomly right now, so it's probably going to cause a few issues. Yeah, I have one right here. There we go. So, okay, so I have a few platforms. Here we go. That's pretty nice. Now I'm just going to regenerate the grid to make sure that it works with the ground, and well, it doesn't. By default, the grid is not generated on top of the environment, so we can just check the grid use environment checkbox right here, and now the grid should, well, okay, it doesn't. It should align itself with the environment, but right now it doesn't, and it's really around 0, 0, 0, and that's not good. And the reason for that is just because the environment is not blocking the right collision channel. The grid is not using the visibility channel, the camera channel, the pound channel. It's using a new custom channel that I added for that grid specifically. So what I'm gonna do is just select all my platforms right here, and I'm gonna go in the collision. So scroll in the collision preset. I'm going to make it custom, and I'm going to make sure that my collisions on my ground are blocking the ground and grid modifier channel right here, which is the channel for my grid, for the ground of my levels. So here we go. I'm blocking the ground and grid modifier. And now if I regenerate my grid by moving it around, here we go. Now we can see that the grid are snapping on top of the environment, but only if we are checking the use environment checkbox. Yeah, we can switch between a basic grid, not based on the environment, and one that uses the environment, just like that. That's pretty good. Okay, so now we have a basic shape to work with, and we can see that we have an error right here, a little issue because my platform doesn't really match the positions of my grid. So I'm just going to move my platform aside just a little bit. And now if I regenerate my grid, here we go. Now it works. It's aligned properly. Okay, good. So now we have a basic canvas we can start working with. And since I made sure that the height between all those platforms is 100 unit maximum, my units are always going to be able to jump from that tile to this tile, let's say, for example. But I can move this platform a little bit higher, and now the unit is not going to be able to jump directly onto that tile. It's going to have to go here, which is a little bit higher, which is 100 unit, and then here to the platform that is 200 units in the air. So yeah, we can do that to create some elevation in the level. So let's say I can move this one a little bit higher, that one I can move it right here, so the unit has to go here first and then go here and then go all the way up here. So yeah, the units are going to go from one platform to the other based on the height that they can reach, depending on the value that you set in the grid, in the Z of the grid. So now I can just regenerate it. Here we go. I'm going to regenerate my grid on top of those new platforms. And before we go to the next step, there's actually one question that a lot of people are asking me, and it is if the project supports slopes. Right now it doesn't, so that's the sad news. It doesn't, but I can still show you what it's gonna do if you try to make a slope in your project. So if I move this platform right here, for example, and I just make it a slope, here we go, I have a nice slope. Now if I regenerate my grid, here we go, grid, it generates some kinds of steps. My projects only support steps right now. The tiles are at the right height, more or less, but they are not oriented following the slope. That might come in a future version if I have time, but for now they are not supported. So if you try to make slopes in your project, it's not gonna work. Instead, I recommend to just add some stairs in there. some smaller steps, kind of the same way I just did right here. So my unit jump here, then there, then here, then there, and it's going up, 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 one step at a time instead of having a slope. So yeah, slopes are not supported, but they might come in the future. I have a lot of requests for that, so I'm probably gonna do it. I just don't know when because I'm pretty busy. Anyway, so now that's good. We have a floor. It's pretty nice. The units can move around, but it's pretty boring. We don't have any obstacles. We don't have anything interesting in the level. It's just a basic floor. So let's just add a few obstacles here and there and a few elements. So I'm gonna add a tree right here. Why not? I'm gonna add another one here. I'm going to add, let's say, a bush here that blocks a few tiles. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Here we go. So it blocks a few tiles. I can add another one, let's say here. Why not? The units can hide behind it. I can have this one right here, make it a little bit bigger. I can put, let's say, oops, another one right here. Why not? Another one here, another one there. Doesn't really matter. Just make it pretty and move your obstacles all over the place where you want them to be. So, okay, I'm gonna add another tree right here at the top just because I don't have any trees there and it's sad. So I'm gonna add a few trees. Here we go. I have trees. Okay, so we now have a more interesting level. We have a few obstacles here and there. That's pretty good, but these obstacles are not really taken into account by the grid right now. They are just basic meshes on top of the grid. They don't really have collisions either, so the grid doesn't know they exist. And to fix that, we're going to have to use a grid modifier, which is a blueprint that you have actually right here, BP grid modifier, that you can use to change the behavior of the grid generation. So let's say I'm going to take a BP grid modifier and add it into my level right here. Here we go. I have a grid modifier. Now I want to convert this tile right here to be an obstacle because I have a tree onto it. So I'm just going to, let's say, move my grid modifier right here. I'm going to make it the same size as the tile. Here we go. So now I have an obstacle grid modifier on top of my tree. I know that it is an obstacle because in my type right here, it's set to obstacle. This grid modifier is an obstacle by default. I've set it to an obstacle because that's the most common one in my opinion, but you can set it to something else. So let's say you want the tiles to cost a double movement point, so you can set it to double cost, or if you want the tiles to be triple cost, you can set it to triple cost, or if you want tiles that are only accessible by flying units only, so let's say tiles that are like this hole right here, maybe you only want the flying units to be able to cross that hole, and that's actually what we're going to do a little bit later. You can use the flying units only modifier, so those tiles are only accessible by the flying units. But right now we are interested by the obstacle, so I'm just going to move the grid modifier obstacle a little bit everywhere to make sure that all my bushes and trees are considered to be obstacle by the grid generation. So I can move one here, one here, one here. I can take that one, make it and put it down a little bit. Oops, it's a little bit too far. I'm going to bring it here. I can make it a little bit bigger right here, so I don't have to duplicate it for all my different obstacles. So I can just make it a little bit bigger so it fits with the environment. Actually, this one right here, I'm going to be lazy. I'm just going to do that. Oops, I moved it instead of copy pasting it. Here we go, just like that. And then I can make it a little bit smaller for that little bush that we have right here. So it's gonna be 2x2 instead of 2x4. Here we go. Now I can move it here also. I'm going to put it this right height. The height is relatively important because it's going to block the line of sight of our spell. So make sure that the height is actually good. Up, if you want your spells to collide with the obstacles that are on your grid. So, okay, copy paste, there we go, 1, 2, 2, move it on top of the object, and yeah, okay, I added way too many objects for this simple example, so here we go, now I'm going to take that one to go on top of the tree that we have right here. Allez. Go. Okay, here we go. So now all my obstacles are going to be considered obstacles by the grid generation, and to see if it worked, well, I'm just going to regenerate my grid. Here we go, regenerate the grid, and now everywhere that we have obstacles like that one, it should not create a tile because, well, the units are not going to be able to walk on those tiles ever. It's an obstacle, so we don't even need a tile for them. So if I go, let's say, close to those objects, let's say this one right here, and I'm going to press G on my keyboard to toggle the game view, and now we can see that, yeah, I don't have a tile right here. It's pretty small difference, but you can see that I don't have a tile right here outlined. The same thing here with my two bushes. Those two bushes are obstacles, so I don't have any tile either here or there, so I'm missing two tiles in between. Same thing for all my trees. That one doesn't have a tile, this one, that one. So all my obstacles on my grid don't have a tile, and yeah, I'm pressing G to toggle the game mode because the grid modifiers are not going to be visible in the game. Obviously, they are just to affect the grid generation. Once the game is started, they are just going to be hidden because we don't want the player to see them, obviously. And the game mode is also accessible right here from the little drop down at the top left, and we have the game view right here. So that's toggling in the game view. Here we go, just like that. So that's good. Now we know how to create obstacles on the grid and remove some tiles from it. Now we're going to do the opposite. We're going to add some tiles where there's no ground right here, because we want the flying units to be able to cross that little hole right here. So I'm just going to do the same thing. I can add a new grid modifier in my level, just like that, and I'm going to make it big enough so it covers the whole hole, just like that. Here we go, here we go, here we go. I have a grid modifier in the hole. Okay, I can make it nice and the right size. That's good. And then I'm going to change the type to be a flying units only type. Here we go. So now only the flying units are going to be able to go onto that area right here where the grid modifier is, and you can do the same thing anywhere you want the flying units to be. So I can, let's say, have another one right here. I can make it a little bit higher this time to be able to fit with the environment. Here we go, it's aligned with this side and that side. So there we go. Now only the flying units are going to walk on those tiles here and there. That's pretty good. So let's just regenerate the grid to see how it goes. Okay, so that's good. Now I have tiles here that you can see behind this modifier. So we can see that we have tiles here, and we also have tiles here. Okay, these ones are not at the right height. They are lower than the grid modifier. That's a bit weird. Actually, it makes sense. By default, the grid modifiers are not affecting the height of the tiles. They are just there to affect the type of the tiles, not the height, not the size, not anything, just the type of the tiles. But in this case right here, I don't have any ground under the grid modifier. I just have a basic grid modifier floating in the air, and since the grid generation doesn't know what to do with that, it just sets the height of the tiles to be 0, which is aligned with the 0 of the world, which actually works for that tile that we have right here because it's aligned with 0 of the world, but it doesn't work here because we want it to be higher. So what we're going to do is simply tell the grid modifier to also affect the height of the tile, and that's as simple as checking the little checkbox that we have right here, use for tile height. There we go. Now if I regenerate my grid, I can generate it real quick, and now we can see that the grids is now generated at the right height based on the grid modifier. So if I decide that I want the grid modifier to be a little bit higher, I can simply regenerate the grid, and now the grid should be higher, the same height as the grid modifier. But in my case, yeah, I'm just going to keep it down a little bit just because it looks a little bit nicer. Okay, so now I'm just going to regenerate the grid, and here we go. Now my tiles are at the right height. Perfect. So now we have tiles that are only accessible by flying units, tiles that are not accessible by anybody because they are obstacles, and now why not creating tiles that are just different? So let's say cost more movement points. So I'm just going to add another grid modifier right here, and for that one I'm going to be super lazy, so we can just make it, let's say, super big. Oops. Okay, we can make it big, doesn't really matter. Here we go, as long as like it makes sense-ish. We can make it, let's say, that size. Here we go, that's fine, covers a bunch of tiles, that's good enough. Okay, so we have, oh, I'm moving a lot, sorry about that. Okay, so we have a grid modifier right here that is going to affect all those tiles right here, and in my case, I don't want them to be obstacles, I want them to be, let's say, double cost. So if a unit walks on any of those tiles right here, it's going to cost 2 movement points instead of 1. That's good. It's going to add a little bit of variation in the game, and you can do that a little bit anywhere. So you can put it like here if you want to, you can move it in diagonal if you want to. It's just going to affect all the tiles that are crossing the middle of the grid modifier. So let's say this tile here, those right here, is going to affect all those tiles right here. And actually, if you want to see the result, you can go inside the grid and toggle the tactical mode, because the grid doesn't actually change color based on the grid modifiers. Otherwise, it would be a little bit weird in the game. But if the player enables the tactical mode, then it's going to display the different colors of the tiles. So here we can see that they are a little bit grayer, because they are costing more movement point. And actually, if I make that one, let's say, a triple cost instead of a double cost, and I regenerate the grid, we can see that now they are darker because now they cost more movement point. But now we have a little bit of flickering, and that's a bit annoying. So let's fix that. But first, I think I'm actually just going to add a little bridge, because I don't have a bridge in my level. So I want to have a bridge. I'm going to add a bridge. I know it's really a little bit of a waste of time, but here we go. I want to have a little bridge right here. It's my level, and I want to do what I want to do. So I'm going to add a bridge, just make sure that the collisions are set up properly. So I'm going to scroll down in my collision and make sure that I'm in custom and block the ground and grid modifier. Here we go. So now if I regenerate the grid, I'm going to have a bridge. Hey, I have a bridge. Okay, good. So that was just to make sure that you know and remember that you have to set up the collision when you add a new element in your level that you want to use for the height of the tiles or actually to affect the grid. Okay, now for the tactical grid, the way it works is just that the grid is going to go through all the objects in the level that are marked as not tactical, which are the objects that are not going to be visible during the tactical mode, and it's simply going to hide all of them, and when we go out of the tactical mode, well, it's going to bring them back up. So to do that, I'm simply using tags on all the assets in my level that I don't want to be visible during the tactical mode. So in my case, I'm just going to select, well, pretty much everything because I want to hide everything during the tactical mode. So I'm just going to select all my meshes that are in my level, so all of them right here, and I'm going to go in their tags to add the not tactical tag. So I'm just going to search for tag. Here we go. We have the actor tag right here. Add a new tag, which is going to be not tactical. Here we go. So all those objects are now not tactical and they should be hidden while the grid is in tactical mode. So I'm going to go back in my grid and check the grid is tactical to see if it works. And well, it seems like it didn't work. Actually, no, it did work. It's just that it's only visible in game view because we are just setting all those actors hidden in game, not just hidden in game. So if I go back in game view right here, or if I press G on my keyboard, I can see that now all those assets are now hidden in game by the tactical mode. And if I bring them back by unchecking that checkbox, we can see that now I'm bringing back real art of my level and I'm adding the tactical grid. So now I can toggle between those, between the tactical grid and the normal grid. So good. Okay, that really gives us a better overview of what's happening in the level, and now we can see that, well, the obstacles are pretty flat. Yeah, that's not good. It works for all the other tiles. These ones are flying units only, and that's good. They are at the right height. These ones too. These ones are pretty nice. They are costing more movement point to walk on, and that's pretty good. But the obstacles are all flat. That's pretty good, but I'd like to have them at the right height so the player knows, okay, we have a super tall obstacles right here, or really a shorter obstacle right there, and that's going to affect the line of sight of the units. If the obstacle is not tall at all, well, the unit is still going to be able to cast a spell through it because we can see through the bush. It's so small and tiny and short, but if there's a big tree in front of the player is not going to be able to cast a spell. So we're just going to make sure that all the obstacles on the grid are at the right height, and to do that, I'm simply going to select all my obstacle grid modifier, which are already at the right height on my grid. So I'm just going to select all of them. I don't know which one are obstacles and which one are not. I think that one is one, that one's an obstacle, that one too, that one is not. Okay, so these are all my obstacle grid modifier, and I'm just going to check the use for tile height, which is going to increase the height of my tiles because that's what it does. And now I'm gonna go back in my grid, regenerate the grid. Here we go. And now if I go in my tactical mode and I go in game view, we can see that now my obstacles are now at the right height. Those bushes are smaller than those big trees that we have right here, and right here. There we go. So that looks a little bit nicer now. Yes. Okay, we have a good overview of what the map looks like, both when we are enabling the tactical mode and when we're disabling it, just like that. And we're actually almost done. We're done with pretty much everything related to the combat. We now have a level that works with the grid, which is used in combat. And since we're done with the grid, we can actually delete the grid because we don't want the grid to be visible in the environment as is. The grid is going to be spawned by the combat system when we start a new combat. So we don't have to have the grid in the environment itself. So the grid is just used as a guide, and now that we used it, well, we're done with it. So let's just delete the grid, and now we're only left with the nice environment that we can use in our game. So that's pretty good. We have a nice level that we can now use anywhere you want in the game. But about that, if you want to use your environment in the overworld, you still have one steps to do, because in the overworld, the units are moving using the Unreal navigation system, which uses a nav mesh, and we don't have any nav mesh in our environment right now. So let's add a new nav mesh to be able to support the overworld navigation of our units. Obviously, if you don't want to support the overworld navigation in your level, because that's just a combat level, it's not going to be an overworld level ever, you don't have to add a nav mesh in your level, because, well, you're not going to need it anyway. But in my case, since I want my level to work both in overworld and in combat, just because I want to show you all the steps of the process and how to set up both type of levels, I'm going to add a nav mesh in my level. Otherwise, you can simply leave it as is, and it's going to work for all the type of combat you want to trigger. So So, okay, good. Let's add a nav mesh to support the overworld movement. So nav mesh bound volume, I'm going to drop it in my level right here. I'm going to scroll down and make it super big. So let's say 5,000, 5,000, 5,000. Okay, this one's a bit big, 5,000. There we go. So I have a big cube and that's generating a nav mesh on top of my level. And that's pretty nice. That's exactly what I want. I have a nav mesh in my level. Now I can move my units around using the nav mesh we just generated. That's perfect. There's a few issues though. Right here, we can see that the units can walk on top of the grid modifier. Yeah, that's not what we want. Same right here, the units are going to go up on the grid modifier. They are not going to be flat with the ground. I don't know why. And same thing right here. Maybe we don't want the units to be able to walk here while we are not in combat. That zone should only be accessible by the flying units during the combat. So I'm going to go inside my grid modifier and disable the pound channel so it doesn't affect the navigation. So I'm going to go, let's say, in this one right here. I'm going to select my components. I'm just going to expand this right here and my static mesh component, go in my collisions and disable the pound channel. So I'm just going to make it overlap instead. So good, now it doesn't affect the navigation. We can see the nav mesh goes here and goes down here. Oh yeah, actually, if you don't see your nav mesh, it's because it's not enabled right here in the show options. So we have the navigation right here. Make sure to check it, otherwise you're not gonna see the nav mesh. I should have said that a little bit before. Anyway, so this is how you enable the nav mesh visualization if you don't see it. Bon, okay, so back to what I was doing, I'm going to also remove the pound channel from this static mesh right here. So static mesh, scroll down, disable the pound channel, then same thing for the hole that we have right here. So static mesh, scroll down, disable the pound channel, and then that one right here, static mesh, scroll down, disable the pound channel. Okay, good. So now the units are not going to be able to cross those holes right here. The obstacles are going to block the navigation, so that's pretty good. Right now they are a little bit wrong and that's not really great, but for the trees it seems to work pretty well, so that's good. And in your case, well, I recommend to just adjust your mesh as much as possible to make sure that the units are going to navigate properly in the overworld. So let's say like that, it's a little bit better. Now the units have to go around those obstacles when they are walking on top of the grid, same as this one right here. If I move it up a little bit, now the units are going to walk around the obstacle. So yeah, there's a little bit of tweaking here or there to make sure that the nav mesh is working properly, but in the big lines, here it is. You just have to add the nav mesh in your level, and now the units should be able to walk around in the overworld no problem and trigger encounters, obviously. Here we go. So now you have a nice environment that you can use in your game, and you can play around with your units in that environment. You can generate your grid anywhere you want. You can generate small grid, big grids. You can toggle the tactical mode or toggle the environment, I say, and then the tactical mode if you want to. And you can do all that in game. And obviously that grid is also going to work for the pathfinding. So let's say I can select a tile, move around. There we go. I can move around, move around, move around. I can add units on the grid to ask them to move. So let's say I can add a bat right here. I can add a chicken right there. I can, let's say, move my bat on top of the flying units only tiles that we have right here. These tiles should not be accessible by the warrior, and they are not, and that's good. These tiles right here, the dark tiles, are costing way too many movement points, so the warrior has to move multiple times to cross them, just like that. The chicken right here cannot go on top of the tiles that are right here because the height difference is a little bit too big, so it has to go all the way around, just like that, to be able to reach the top of this little mountain that we have. And the chicken has to go down, 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 just like that, to be able to go all the way back down. So yeah, obviously this video was more oriented around the art of your level and creating the level itself, adding collisions here and there, the nav mesh, and making sure that the environment is ready to be used by the game. I didn't show you how to add your debug menu in game and be able to use all your actions with your environment. That's gonna be in another video, because anyway, the environment is completely independent from the rest of the game. You can have as many environments as you want, you can make them as big and as small as you want, but the combat system is going to decide where it wants to start the combat, which region of the level you want to use for your combat, where you want to spawn your grid, where the units are going to move in the overworld. So the environment itself is just the art of your game. It's not going to affect anything else as long as the grid modifier are placed properly. And same thing for the nav mesh. And actually about the nav mesh, we're going to test it. I'm just going to disable the tactical mode, go in the overworld and add a few units. Here we go. These units are in the overworld, and now I can move them in the overworld. Here we go. I can move them around. They are all in the same group in the overworld, so they are all moving around, and that's pretty good. So the navigation in the overworld also works. And if I try to start a combat, let's say Going to add a unit in the opposing team, just like that. Here we go, and start a combat, and now I can start a combat with those units on top of the new level we just created, and that works pretty well. I can cast spell as before, I can do anything I want, because, well, the level is built properly, and that's nice. Good. Okay, so I guess we're done with everything I wanted to show you today. You now know how to create your own level, a level that's going to work with the rest of the game. So yeah, that's gonna be it for today's video. I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye!